How can a book on anti-Semitism be called beautiful? And how do we analyze hatred without normalizing it? These are some of the topics that we are going to discuss today with Dr. Flora Cassen, who is joining us. Welcome, Flora.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're so happy that you're here to have this conversation. And I just want to start with a short introduction. For those of you who are not yet familiar with Flora, Flora was born and raised in a Jewish family in Antwerp, Belgium. And she is a highly respected historian, scholar, and currently serves as the director of the Brandeis Center for Jewish Studies and the director for the Center of the Study of Anti-Jewishness at Brandeis University. She's also a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And recently, Flora published her newest book. It is a blend of memoir and historical scholarship called Stained Glass, A Reflective History of Anti-Semitism. I want to first start our conversation, Flora, if you could give us the bit of the background to your book. Let's start with the title. Can you tell us a little bit about what is stained glass, what does it refer to, and what is a reflective history?
So the stained glass refers to the stained glass in the Cathedral of Brussels, which is the capital of Belgium, where I grew up. And it turns out that much of the art in that cathedral, most of the stained glass, the paintings, the tapestries, tell the story of a host desecration accusation against the Jews of Brussels in 1370. 6 Jewish men were burned at the stake as a result of that accusation, and the rest of the Jewish community was expelled. And then over the years, it kind of became the miracle associated with that cathedral. And just to be specific, the miracle is not the accusation against the Jews, it's the fact that when Jews stole those wafers and then proceeded to torture them, those wafers bled. And that's what you see on the cover of the book. You see a group of Jews hunched over and they're holding knives, and the wafers, those white circles, are bleeding. And that's the miracle, right? Because it shows that the body of Christ was present in those wafers. And so that's become a miracle associated with the cathedral and attracted pilgrims, worshippers for centuries. I kind of started to think about the questions I raised in the book in 2014 when there was a shooting at the Jewish Museum in Brussels and 4 people were shot at the entrance of the museum. And I remember, on the one hand, it was a tragedy and it was horrible. And on the other hand, in the days that followed, it all became a question about, the importation of a Middle Eastern conflict into Europe. And it struck me as a kind of, easy way out of a very difficult question, because steps away from that museum, you have the cathedral. And, Belgium, as much of Europe, has a long history of anti-Jewishness and layers. And it struck me as a kind of comforting myth to believe that, when something happens here, it's because it's a conflict that's important from a different part of the world, instead of actually confronting those layers. So the book, in a way, became a very personal and extended reflection on those questions about the history of anti-Semitism, about what does it mean that there's those monuments still there? How do they still have an impact in the present? Do people understand what they mean? And so on. And so that sort of became a reflection that I conducted about that. And then I guess there's a kind of wordplay because of what gets, right, how the light gets reflected through those windows. So there are both things in there.
It's very powerful concept that you're bringing up now, and I'm curious. You started to talk about how these images and public displays impact on our consciousness today and the public consciousness. I remember when I was walking, I traveled through Europe many times in many different countries. And as somebody who really has an obsession with Jewish history, I was walking around thinking, oh, well, this is the plaza where these Jews were burned. And this is the plaza where, there was this disputation. And so I'm curious what you think about now. I mean, the stained glass and these public displays, how are they impacting the public perception of Jews these days?
It's a complicated question because many of these displays are old. And of course, Jews know that they are there. Jews know about those places where tragedies happened. Well, most people probably don't know or are not aware. It's often not clearly marked. What's interesting, and that's also part of the book, is that I'm constantly toggling back and forth between my upbringing in Europe and my life in America, and the differences between those two places. And I became very conscious of that difference when we started having very difficult debates here in the United States about, for example, Confederate statues. Right? What does it mean that some university campuses in the South or some cities often still have Confederate statues? And, are we signaling that, for example, part of the population is not welcome here, is not, right? What do we say about our society based on the statues, the monuments that we put on our public squares and that we honor? And I think Americans have had a very difficult and I think important debate about that. And it struck me watching that. First of all, I learned a lot about American history that I didn't know, but also it struck me that those debates are not really happening in Europe. So there's a kind of silence about that in a way, when you know about it, it's maybe kind of a loud silence. And there has been reluctance and a refusal to talk about it. For example, in 1960s, the Jewish community in Belgium asked, the church to maybe put plaques, and that wasn't possible at the time. There was a lot of resistance. But very interestingly, just last week, they put a plaque under those windows in which the church is asking for forgiveness to the Jewish people. And when I saw that picture, I honestly had tears in my eyes, because I remember being in that church a couple of years ago and standing in front of that image, and a guardian of the cathedral walked up to me and asked me if I'm Jewish. And I said, yeah. And I wasn't sure what was coming after that, but what came after that was an apology. He said, I feel sorry. I think the church should apologize for that imagery. And I didn't quite know what to do. And then he went on to tell me that every year, hundreds and thousands of worshippers come precisely because of that miracle. They come to the cathedral in Brussels. And so I felt very ambivalent about that apology, right? What does an apology like that mean if you're not doing something about it? And just last week, without any big announcement or fanfare, probably because it is still controversial within the church, they added a small plaque under that window. So that's actually a very moving gesture.
Do you feel that might be signaling a new chapter for the Jewish community there?
Let's see. I hope so. At the same time, today is different than the 1960s. There has been a rise of antisemitism in Belgium recently, right? I think a synagogue a few weeks ago was put on fire in Liège, in the south of Belgium. So the situation has gotten worse in the meantime. And, the plaque is a great beginning, and it's an essential one, right? It has to start with an acknowledgement and an apology. But also, I think some of those ideas, some of that imagery reappears in interesting ways. For example, I don't know if you remember, I think it was maybe in December 2023, the war in Gaza had started, and then that meme appeared, that Jesus is a Palestinian, and you would see images of Palestinian children cradled in their mother's arms, and like imagery that was reminiscent in an interesting way, in a debate that was not at all Christian or religious, that was reminiscent of that imagery. So I think the work needs to be sustained and deeper.
And when you refer to the work, are you referring to developing an awareness of the history or developing a sensitivity? What kind of work are you referring to exactly?
I think that the way a lot of stereotypes about groups in society work, right? The way a lot of that work is that some of those ideas become implicit and embedded in culture. And we're very comfortable, I think, generally with that idea. For example, when it comes to for example, discrimination against women, right? The idea that, a woman at work will be more flexible, or she will be okay bringing the coffee, or this and that, right? This is based on sort of internalized ideas about what a woman's role should be. And we're pushing back against that. And then we're making those ideas by making those ideas explicit, we can push back against that. And I think that often doesn't happen when we're talking about anti-Semitism, because the discussion very quickly again shifts to Israel-Palestine, the war in Gaza, everything that's happened there. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a discussion about that. Of course we should, but that when we, instead of having discussions about specific military actions or whatever is going on, we start talking in these kind of generalized terms that evoke some of that older religious anti-Jewish imagery. And oftentimes I think it's unconscious. And I think the work of, making maybe some of those unconscious biases conscious will just help us have better conversations, because I think we should have difficult conversations about the war. But when those critiques are expressed in ways that evoke these biases and old stereotypes, it's harder, I think. And so that's where I think is the work. And it's not only in that context that it reappears, obviously, but that's just an example.
Do you feel that this is something that started specifically with the events of October 7th, this conflation between anti-Semitism and the government in Israel, or what happens in Israel and Gaza?
No, like I said, in 2014 in Brussels, I was surprised. The person who attacked the museum, the shooter, was a French citizen. He happened to be Muslim, but is that a reason to turn the attack into, something that is not, about how different communities interact and treat each other in Europe? I don't think so. So I think it's been longer term trend than that. I gave those examples in my previous answer because they're the most recent one, and that people might recognize who listen to the conversation, but I don't think it's only from there.
Let's shift specifically to your book, because there was a theme in your book that I found to be very fascinating, and that was the story of your grandparents. So can you walk us through the story of your grandparents and tell us a bit of the background there? And as a historian, what did their experience teach you?
So my grandparents lived in Belgium, right, in 1940, when the Germans attacked, and they were Jewish. And so once, the German invasion of Belgium took exactly 18 days. It was a very, very quick invasion. And so after that, they lived for 2 years under German occupation. It was an increasingly difficult situation for Jews. And they didn't know each other, actually, at the beginning of the war. They met during the war. They started dating, which meant, just holding hands at the time. And I think at some point my grandfather realized that if they stay there, the Germans were going to massacre them all. And so he asked my grandmother to live with him. And at first they thought they needed to get to the south of France, because they had heard that was a free zone and that the persecution of Jews wasn't as bad there as it was elsewhere. But they were incorrect, right? The free zone was the Vichy government, which was a very collaborative government that was arresting, in fact, especially foreign Jews, but also French Jews. And then soon after they arrived there, it was becoming clear to everyone that the Germans were also going to invade in the coming weeks southern France. And so they had to get out of there. They tried to get visas and passports and everything they needed to get. Of course, that was a tragedy of Jewish refugees at the time, right? They needed official papers to save their lives, but they couldn't get them. And eventually they decided to try and make it to Spain and Portugal, which weren't occupied, and they had to walk across the Pyrenees mountain range, they were not expert, hikers. And my grandmother, in addition, was 5 months pregnant. And so they had to literally, for parts of the trek, my grandfather had to carry her. Eventually they made it to to Spain, but right after crossing the borders, they were arrested by Spanish police. And it's possible that maybe they had been denounced by their guides or someone else, because literally it seemed like the police was waiting for them. And the police had received orders to send them back to France. And of course, if that happened, it meant the French were going to give them. By then, in fact, the Germans were occupying the south of France too. So that meant that they were going to be arrested and given to the Germans. And my pregnant grandmother certainly would not have survived that. So they were desperate, trying to figure out what to do, not to be sent back. And it turned out that in that small village where they arrived and had been arrested, there was a woman there who pleaded to give my grandmother a few days to rest because she was, not feeling well, having done that walk, being pregnant. And somehow Spanish police agreed. They left a guard there to make sure they're not going anywhere, but they said, we'll come back to take you in a couple of days. And in the meantime, my grandfather was able to call the Belgian consul in Madrid, and that man didn't help any Jews, he wasn't interested in that, and that's not what he did. But in the conversation, my grandfather mentioned that he fought in the Belgian army when the Germans invaded, and that he in fact had been recognized for his bravery. And when the consul heard that, he said, okay, if you will agree to join the Belgian army in Africa, I will get you out of there. And so my grandfather said yes. And next thing they know, they're on a ship to the Belgian Congo.
Wow.
And so it's a fascinating story because we're so used to thinking in these binary terms. You're oppressor or you're oppressed, you're right on the side of the victors or the vanquished. And in some ways, what happened to my grandparents is an incredible sort of reversal of their situation, because once they arrived in the Belgian Congo, the group they belonged to the most was the Belgian colonial elite. My grandfather was an officer in the army there. And so they in a way adopted the lifestyle of Belgian colonists. So in many ways, they will continue to be discriminated against, but it was more of that polite social discrimination. They were invited to birthdays. People were making funny comments around them about Jews. But of course, that was nothing compared to what they escaped in Europe, nor compared to the situation of Black Congolese people in the Congo. And suddenly my grandmother is running a household with a number of Black Congolese servants. My grandfather is ordered, really, he didn't have a choice. He had to join the army once there, and he's made the commander of an entire company of Black soldiers, and was part of his job to discipline them when they did things wrong. As a historian, I know the history, and it's fascinating. And as a granddaughter, I struggled, and I think I described that in the book. I struggled with these two parts of history that I inherited. And I inherited one part of history where my grandparents were, the victims and miraculously escaped an almost certain death. And then I struggle with the fact of myself being a Belgian citizen and the colonial history of my country, which to this day it has not fully acknowledged. It's complicated. And I think, it's these tensions and complexities that make history interesting. And, sometimes I wish when we look at situations in the present, we would incorporate more of that complexity sometimes. We live in such a polarized society. And so, what people tend to do is go in the bubbles where people agree with them. And a lot of that complexity gets lost in the middle. And what I try to do in the book is model how to do that. And we're doing it with my own history.
What you're describing is fascinating. And the story that you're telling about your grandparents really does show that it's this tangled web of identities. What you would say about how nations and how communities can grapple with those dark periods in history. I mean, you're talking as someone who grew up in Belgium, and you're discussing a time when Belgium was a colonial empire. Did you learn about that period in history, or did they kind of whitewash it?
You know, when I was a child in school in Belgium, it was very much whitewashed. I remember learning that Leopold II, who was the second king of the country, and he colonized the Congo, was really perhaps our smartest king because because you know Belgium is a very small country in Europe. And none of the larger European countries wanted Belgium to have, you know, the Congo is, I don't know, 20 times larger than Belgium itself, right? It's a gigantic um, uh, country. Belgium is a small and fairly new country in Europe. It doesn't match to to Great Britain or France or Germany. And so none of the great European powers at the time wanted Belgium to have a colony. They wanted to have all the colonies. And somehow Leopold II managed that. And so that's what I learned. And that was it, right? I didn't learn anything about what happened there. And it's interesting. It's only after I left and went to grad school in New York that I started learning more and reading about that. And I think that to this day, much of the reckoning has happened more outside of the country than in the country. In the country, it's still a, a sensitive issue for the country, right? Something that it has not fully acknowledged or grappled with or you know, figured out what to do with that parts of its history. And then, of course, you know, the question of reparations, compensations, none of that has even been opened up. There hasn't been even a public acknowledgement, I think, of what happened. So it's still a difficult part of history. How countries deal with their own histories or the darker pasts of their histories is always very complicated because it challenges how people want to see each other. And I think we see that everywhere. We see that in the United States, grappling with the history of slavery and civil war and so on. And we see that in Europe, whether it's the Holocaust or colonialism or other parts of European history. These are very, I think, difficult and lengthy processes that,
Yeah.
you know, people go through.
And we also live in a time now where we're in this cancel culture. So it seems
Right.
like it's all or nothing. How do you respond to that? You're a professor, you teach Jewish history, taught in many different universities. And so when these chapters come up in your lessons and in your classes, so how do we grapple and acknowledge our past and our dark chapters in history without either whitewashing it in the one sense or canceling it?
You know, it's very difficult. And I think that there are two different things going on. On the one hand, it's history. The history is history, you know, it happens and we can, you know, we have a lot of professional historians who do great work and they can write books very factually with evidence from archives, from oral sources, if it's recent enough, about what happened. And we have that information. And I think that that's one, you know, number one important thing. History is history. We can't change it. We have to accept that, you know, this is what happened. This is what our country did. The second question is, you know, what do we do as a nation, as a people with that history that we inherit, right? And oftentimes maybe people call that more memory, right? The memory that was transmitted to me as a child about the Congo was very incomplete in many ways. And like you say, whitewashed a lot of things. And so I think there's these two, in a way, parallel processes. And you know, I think maybe part of the pushback that we have seen recently is that a lot of that memory work came with a demand implicitly or explicitly for people to generations later kind of accept maybe the guilt or the responsibility for what happened before. And I think naturally people will react against that, right? You know, if something your grandparents, great grandparents did, I mean, you're not responsible. And I think that demand is maybe what provoked a backlash. I think as a society, sometimes we can think, look, maybe we should repair for something that, you know, our country as a nation did a generation or two ago. I think there is a place for a serious discussion about that and for doing it in the right way without demanding that people carry a guilt that they have no reason to carry. And so I think this is where it's very difficult, and different countries maybe will find different solutions to that. But that's where I think if we use history to judge people in the present, it's not going to work, right?
Yeah.
If we use history to have serious, informed discussions about what happened and what we can do, not individually, but collectively as a group, to repair some of that. I think that's then a different conversation. I wish we could have that conversation, but we've gotten stuck in the first one.
Yeah. So now I'm curious to ask you about another topic that you talk about in your book, which is that it sounds like what you're describing is precisely what world Jewry and many nations have done with regards to Holocaust commemoration and Holocaust memory. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that have been pumped into monuments and plaques and museums and educational programs. And from what I understand, you seem to say that it's actually created a resentment in Europe towards the Jews.
I think that to an extent in Europe it has, and that is very different, I think, from the situation in the United States, and that I think has maybe come from a feeling a lot of people had that, when we were talking about the Holocaust, we're only talking about Jews or Jews and other victims, of the Nazis, because Jews weren't alone. But the reality is that World War II happened across Europe. A lot of people suffered. A lot of people lived under occupation. A lot of people have stories about that. Some people collaborated, and I think, we have to reckon with that. Some people just tried to live their lives and survive. Some people resisted, right? It's sort of a complicated situation. But I think sometime in the 1990s, it kind of became 50 years had passed, and I think a lot of people in Europe sort of realized, this is what happened. This is what, Europeans did, and we have to kind of, atone for that or do something. But these public displays of atonement or asking for forgiveness, and then some of the museums that were built, I think provoked a kind of backlash because it, I think, did not include perhaps the full story. But also because, and I was saying this before, right, it forced people to confront a part of their history that is not how they imagine themselves or their countries, right? People want to think that their countries are great. And, each country does a lot of good stuff, but also sometimes bad stuff. And I think, I don't think it was wrong. I think people had to acknowledge it. I'm just noting that the result was not what I thought it's going to be, right? When I heard those public acknowledgements in the 1990s coming from governments, I was very hopeful that something was going to change. I believed that countries that acknowledge their histories don't repeat it. And ever since then, we've seen antisemitism rising, and we've seen a kind of reaction against a sort of history of shame that is being imposed upon us. It's a sentence I've heard many times. And so this is really what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. Of course, we should do that. I'm just, in retrospect, wondering if there was maybe a better way to do it, a way that brings reconciliation rather than, we're only talking about you. You're getting money for this, right? It became, it sort of became this unfortunate situation. And it's just very difficult. And what's also interesting with Holocaust memory is that, most Jews did not stay in Europe. Most left. They went to the United States, they went to Israel. And so you have very sort of powerful and healthy memory cultures about the Holocaust in the United States or in Israel. But of course, they're not on contested ground. And I think that's given the impression to people that this is a part of history that was dealt with, except it was not dealt with where it happened. It was dealt with in other places where survivors went. And so I think it was important for Jewish communities to have those places where they can remember, but it didn't play the role of sort of reconciliation in Europe itself, where in some ways maybe, just not enough Jews were left.
Yeah,
Because the genocide was successful and because a lot of survivors left.
And In your book, in one of the first chapters, you talk about when you first arrived in the States, how surprised you were that there were Jewish students who were talking so openly about their Jewish identity. And then you were reflecting back to the time that you were in university in Brussels, and you were saying that your religious identity, specifically with Jews, you don't talk about that. And so I'm curious, with regards to what you're saying now about, being on, uncontested ground, do you feel that that's had implications for a sense of safety or safe self-expression in terms of Jewish identity outside of Europe?
I remember, for example, at some point I was a teenager riding the bus from school and looking around me and realizing, every older person with white hair probably was in their 20s, during the war. And what did they do, right? And I remember also a feeling of lightness when I arrived in the United States, that I suddenly was in a different place, and that wasn't, where it happened. And that, I think, allows for a kind of a sense of confidence also to the American Jewish community that, of course, there's a history of anti-Semitism also in the United States. But what happened in Europe never happened here, and especially in the second half of the 20th century is a time where American Jews became accepted, in universities, in so many professions, in so many neighborhoods where they weren't accepted before, right? So that trajectory between, Europe and America is so different. And so I understand that sense of greater confidence. But even having TV shows like Seinfeld that have so many right Jewish references, and everybody thought that's funny and everybody understood them. And it's not something that you could have had in Europe. And to be honest, I've often wondered, what did European Jews, what were we not able to do in Europe to establish Jewish communities with the same roots and connections and alliances across different groups and people in society. And American Jews have done that incredibly well. And it's something that I keep watching and being impressed by.
And yet there's a rise in
And yet there's a
anti-Semitism
rise.
across the states. What do you suggest for students, especially on college campuses? How can they feel safe and confident when anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism has increased so significantly?
The conversations are very, very difficult. There were those months with the protests after October 7, where, right, where a lot of anti-Semitism was documented, where, sometimes when there were encampments, Jews couldn't go there. But I think in many ways that has also calmed down. And I don't think, Jewish students are unsafe on college campuses. I think there are many conversations that are difficult and probably uncomfortable. And, I think we should have them. And I think we should show that we can have them and we can hold our ground, and we don't, crumble down under pressure, which, a lot of people are saying is kind of a characteristic of this generation now, that they don't have that practice in having, difficult debates and conversations. And I would say to Jewish students that they can show the way, and they must show the way. What I was saying just before, that I think what impresses me about the American Jewish community is how present it has made itself in so many walks of life in America. And, one thing that worries me is if the Jewish community suddenly starts to close in on itself instead of showing up. And I think, continuing to show up, to me, is one of the most important things. Not hiding who we are, agreeing with the, an anti-Zionist argument, or at least the most, extreme of those, but really showing up, standing our ground, showing that, we're reasonable and we've thought about it. I think that's incredibly important. And I don't mean to, minimize any of the rise of anti-Semitism. I think it's been documented and many people have seen it. But I also, look, I say in the book, I know the past, I don't know the future, right? So that's a really difficult question. It still seems to me, even with this serious rise, that the sort of structure of society in America is very different than the one in Europe. And so, and the position of the American Jewish community is also very different. And so, that gives me hope that it is something that, can be discussed and debated, and it might be very difficult. And that's also another point I make in the book, that, sometimes history is super useful because it gives us a way to think about the present. And sometimes history can maybe distort our understanding of the present. And I wonder if sometimes our memory of the Holocaust does that, because if we think anti-Semitism is rising, a Holocaust is coming, well, then of course, right? It's you stay or you leave. It's a binary decision. If you're thinking Jewish history is long, there have been many moments where things were hard, but Jewish communities overcame. And fortunately, the Holocaust was a one-time event so far, right? There's been one genocide against the Jewish people, not more than one. And so if we can, and I suggest, looking at earlier periods in history, how Jews stayed where they were, made the arguments, and showed incredible creativity and resilience in staying in their societies. And I wonder if, of course, we have to be very wary and careful, but at the same time, the model is not either everything goes well or it's a Holocaust, right? There could be a historical model that says, look, things are mixed. There's a rise in anti-Semitism, but so far you still find, Jewish communities in most big cities. You still find Jewish students in the best schools. You still find, right, Jews getting jobs in some of the right big companies and hospitals and law firms and wherever they want to work in the United States. And so I think we have to take in the whole picture too.
Definitely. And as we wrap up, what do you hope that readers will understand and take away from your book?
One of the things I did in this book that was maybe the hardest thing for me as an academic, right? So when you go to grad school, you learn that everything you write has to have an argument. And you say the argument at the beginning, and then you prove it, and then you say it again in the end. And this book, I decided to write it for a broader audience. And one of the things I had to stop myself from doing is saying, this is what I'm arguing, and this is what you should take away from my book. So I hope that people, read it as a story. There are pieces they may agree with, there are pieces they may disagree with. I welcome, reactions and conversations, but an understanding of Jewish history, Jewish European history, how things are sometimes reflected in the present in painful ways. And I hope I model a way of having, honest and complicated debates, because one of the things, and you mentioned it, right, that's happened today with polarization is that we don't have that anymore, because it's much easier to live in bubbles where everyone agrees.
And social media only amplifies that.
Exactly, and social media amplifies that. And so I'm, in a small way, hoping to push back against that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation
Thank
with
you.
me. I always find talking with you to be fascinating, and I encourage
Same.
everyone to go out and get a copy of Stained Glass, A Reflective History of Anti-Semitism. And until next time, thank you.